Human rights. You hear that phrase thrown around all the time, right? But what does it actually mean? Well, today, we're going to go on a journey. We're going to trace this incredibly powerful idea from its ancient roots in fairness, all the way to the super complex ethical questions we're facing in our digital world.
But first, let's start with a really big question, a kind of puzzle that sits right at the heart of this whole thing. If we all have rights, just by being human, then why on earth are we still fighting for them? Why do we see people struggling for basic dignity and justice literally every day? That's the core question we're going to try and unpack together.
Okay, so to even start answering that, we've got to be on the same page. We need to get crystal clear on what we're actually talking about. Let's start with the basics. What are human rights?
So here's the core idea. Human rights are the fundamental claims that you and I can make, not because some government gave them to us, but just because we're, human. They aren't something you earn, and they can't be taken away. They're all based on this one powerful belief, that every single person has inherent worth. It's non-negotiable.
Now, it's super important to understand how these are different from some other ideas that sound kind of similar. So you've got natural rights. These are big moral ideas, often from philosophy. Then you have legal rights, which is just the stuff that's actually written down in the law. Human rights are special. Think of them as a bridge. They take that big moral idea from natural rights and say, hey, this needs to be a real, enforceable legal right. They connect the ideal to the reality.
So where did this whole game-changing idea even come from? I mean, it didn't just appear out of thin air, right? Nope. Its journey through history is this incredible story of slow, step-by-step, hard-won progress.
If you go way back to ancient times, the big ideas were more about duty and compassion, not really individual rights. But then, bam, 1215, the Magna Carta. This was a huge deal. For the first time, it was put in writing that a king's power wasn't absolute. Even a monarch had to follow the law. That little seed of an idea just exploded a few centuries later during the Enlightenment, when philosophers started talking about rights to life, liberty, and property for everyone. And all of it, was leading up to one massive moment, 1948.
Yeah, after the absolute horror of World War II, the world basically came together and said, never again. The result? The Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that first sentence? It's just so powerful. It became the shared promise for the whole world, a benchmark that every nation should aim for.
But the story didn't stop in 1948. Not at all. The very idea of what counts as a right has kept growing, like an expanding circle. So you had the first generation. That's your classic stuff. Freedom of speech, the right to vote. Then came the second generation, which said, hey, you can't really be free if you don't have things like healthcare or an education. The third generation got even broader, talking about group rights, like the right to peace or a clean environment. And today, we're literally defining the fourth generation right now, tackling things like digital privacy and AI ethics. The circle just keeps getting bigger.
Okay, but a declaration, no matter how amazing it sounds, is still just, a declaration. It's a statement of ideals. It's not a law. So the big question is, how did we get from these inspiring words to actual rules that have legal teeth?
Well, the huge leap forward happened in 1966. That's when the UN adopted two massive, binding treaties. This is key. When a country signs these, they're not just saying they agree with the ideals anymore. They are now legally required to protect those rights. This is the moment the promise became the law on an international scale.
Okay, so that's the global picture. But how does this big international framework actually work on the ground, inside a specific country? For that, the Indian Constitution is an absolutely perfect example of how you bring these ideas home.
And when you look at the structure, it's pretty incredible. You've got Part 3 of the Constitution, which locks in all those first-generation civil and political rights, freedom of speech, equality. They're legally protected. Then, Part 4 lays out the second-generation social and economic rights, like the right to work and education, as goals the government has to work towards. Think about it. For a brand new country at the time, this was revolutionary. They basically hardwired the international human rights framework right into their own legal system, and it gave the courts the power to use those global standards to interpret their own laws.
Okay, so having strong laws like that is absolutely crucial. But this brings us right back to where we started, doesn't it? The existence of a law doesn't automatically mean the fight is over. The struggle for rights is a real, ongoing, daily thing, even when the protections are written down in black and white.
And this is the reality check, right? The promise that's written in a constitution doesn't always match what people actually experience on the ground. This is especially true for groups that have been marginalized for a long time. The real fight, the ongoing fight, happens in that gap. the gap between what the law says and what people live through every single day.
So, for example, if you look at Dalit communities, the struggle against deep-seated social discrimination is still very real, even with powerful laws in place to stop it. For Adivasi communities, it's often a fight to protect their land and their culture from the pressures of modern development. And for women, the battle for true equality and safety is fought every single day, despite having all these legal guarantees. The law is a super important tool, for sure, but the actual work of making those rights a reality, that's a constant effort.
So all of this brings us to the future. I mean, if this whole idea of human rights has already changed so much, from limiting a king's power all the way to today, where could it possibly go next?
I think the most important thing to take away from all this is that human rights aren't some static thing carved in stone. It's a living, breathing idea. And as our world changes, as our technology, our society, our environment changes, our understanding of what it means to live with dignity, that has to change too.
And so, that leaves us with one last really big question that kind of brings everything full circle. We've watched this idea of rights evolve from just limiting a king's power all the way to guaranteeing things like healthcare. Every one of those steps was a reaction to the challenges of the time. So now, with AI and digital technology completely reshaping our lives, what do you think the next fundamental human right will be? Seriously, the story isn't over. It's still being